everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so excited every year when I attend one of these meetings. I see more and more of my students in the audience. So that's great. It's wonderful to see you all going through our program at University of Florida and then hopefully finding your dream job in fire. So today I'm going to be talking to you about fire seasonality. It can sometimes be a bit of a sticky subject, but also about fire frequency. So I always like to start my talks by stressing that I'm not just an academic in an ivory tower. I do have my boots on the ground. I started as a wildland firefighter years ago. And so I've been doing this a really long time. I always say that I've gone from a firefighter to an igniter, but not just an igniter of fires, but hopefully also an igniter of curiosity, interest, and excitement about prescribed burning. So although I started as a wildland firefighter, I am now a professor at the University of Florida, and I teach students how to burn. So they get their S130-190 through my lab, and they get that boots on the ground training. So if anybody needs burn volunteers, my students are always looking for opportunities. So if you get anything from this talk today, there's one thing I want you to walk away with. If you're burning, you're doing a great job, okay? There are so many challenges to burning, so many decisions that need to be made, that I commend all of you who are burning. You are doing a great job. So if you get one thing out of this today, you're doing a great job. And why are you doing a great job? Well, you are helping to conserve and manage our natural systems. Studies worldwide have repeatedly shown that prescribed burning is important. And we know this, right? If we remove fire from a system, if it is fire suppressed, we see fundamental changes in the structure and in the biodiversity. So I'm showing you an example here. On the left is unburned, and you can see that we've lost a lot of that understory vegetation and the canopy has closed. Okay? We've probably all seen systems like this, right? We also know that altering the fire frequency can have some effect on the structure of these systems. So if we're burning very, very frequently, for example, every year, we're going to start losing some of that shrub and woody component. It's not going to be as dominant. Whereas if we have less frequent fires, say every 3, 4, 5, a little bit longer, we're going to have more of that shrub and woody component in the understory. So we've all seen this, yes? Okay. I do want to note that not one frequency fits all plant communities. Of course, we have a lot of diversity in our communities across Florida. The Florida Natural Areas Inventory recognizes 42 native communities, and 16 of those in Florida are actually fire dependent. Now, what does it mean to be fire dependent? It means that we're going to see a fundamental change in the plant community if fire frequency is altered, okay? So making sure that we know what frequency is appropriate for our system is important. So to that end, we need to know our plants. And sand pine is a really good example of knowing our plants. If we're burning too soon after the establishment of sand pine, then maybe they haven't produced cones. They're not going to have seeds that are available for regeneration. Now, if we wait too long also to burn sand pine, we see that trees, when they're really mature, when they're older, just like us, they start to senesce. They're not as productive. So sort of an intermediate frequency when you consider this plant, and the life history of the plant will tell you when it's best to burn. Let me give you another example that's quite near and dear to my heart. This is what I worked on for my PhD. I was in the Florida Panhandle studying 3 different species of Hypericum. Common name is St. John's wort. And we find that these species have 3 ways of regenerating after fire. At one end of the spectrum, we have obligate reseeders. They cannot resprout after fire. They have to regenerate via seed. The other end of the spectrum are obligate resprouters. They mainly regenerate by resprouting after fire. Now, that's not to say that they're not going to produce seedlings. They're just extremely rare. I studied these plants for about 8 years, and I only found 2 seedlings in 8 years. So that tells you kind of how infrequently these resprouters will produce seedlings. The facultative reseeder resprouter is sort of the best of both worlds. They can both resprout and they can regenerate from seeds after fire. Now, what's important to understand in this system is that these plants also have different times to reproductive maturity, which kind of gives us an idea of how much time they need between fires. The obligate resprouter takes about 1 year to reach reproductive maturity, produce seeds, although seeds aren't particularly important for that species. The facultative reseeder resprouter takes 3 to 5 years. And I should also note that with the facultative reseeder resprouter, they can only survive and resprout after fire if the fire is a really low intensity. Then the obligate reseeder, this is Hypericum chapmanii. If anyone's familiar with this plant, it looks like a tree. It's taller than me when it reaches maturity, and it takes more than 10 years to reach reproductive maturity. Now, this one really depends on its seeds. So if you're burning it more frequently than every 10 years, what you're going to eventually do is remove all of the seeds from the seed bank. Those seeds will resprout, they'll grow, you'll kill the existing plants with fire, but if there are no seeds that have been contributed in the meantime, you can actually lose the species from the community. Well, it's quite convenient that these plants also occur along a gradual ecocline, with the obligate resprouter being in the more upland area, the facultative reseeder resprouter being in sort of an intermediate area along this gradual elevational transition, and then the obligate resprouter are in the more lowland areas that just don't burn as frequently. In fact, in the lowland areas where we find the reseeder, there's often seasonal flooding, so standing water when we might be burning these areas. And so it's also less likely fire is going to spread into those areas because the fuels are quite heterogeneous there. Now, these occur along the same elevational gradients, so they're really within about 100 feet of each other. So they also occur together. And depending on, how fires are lit, how often they're lit, these plants will also move kind of up and down this elevational transition. So kind of a cool system. I should also note that the change in elevation is only about 30 centimeters from the more upland to the more lowland areas, but hey, that's all we need in Florida, right? When I was first starting my PhD, I came and met, some of you may know Jean Huffman. She gave me a tour of this area and she lured me by telling me that I was going to see dunes. I grew up in Indiana. Has anybody ever been to the Indiana dunes? They're huge, they're stories tall. So I was so excited. I'd love to work on dunes. What an amazing system. We hike around all day and I say, can we go to the dunes now? And Jean said, you're standing on them. These are the dunes. So that actually made me even more excited about the systems in Florida and how these small elevational changes can really make a big difference in the plant community. And also, fire heterogeneity plays a role. So here's a photo of Hypericum chapmanii. That's the one that prefers to be in the wetter area and is sensitive to those frequent burns. It's a reseeder. And you can see here that a flowering plant was not burned during this fire. So this plant is then contributing seeds for the next generation, in addition to those seeds that are below ground. So there's this combination of fire frequency, but also this heterogeneity that's important for this plant. So this is one of those examples of know your plants. So different plant species have very unique relationships with fire, and understanding those are really important for management and helps us determine the fire regimes that we should apply. So a good example of this would be Orthochylis, which is the giant orchid. My lab studies this in near Orlando. And we've been watching that as the time since fire increases, we get fewer and fewer and fewer orchids. So by making these observations and looking at how this plant responds to more time since fire, we're able to sort of determine, okay, this should probably be burned about every 2 to 3 years, or we start losing some of these orchids. So let's talk a little bit about fire seasonality. This one is kind of a hard one for me because fire seasonality can be defined in such different ways. If you tell me, oh, we lit a dormant season fire, I'm going to say, wait a minute, can you give me like the date or the month? Because depending on where you are, even where you are within the state, makes a big difference on how these seasons are defined. And different people define them in slightly different ways. So we've heard winter, spring, summer, fall, wet, dry, lightning, non-lightning. Even if you go to different regions, these same terms are used. So for instance, I do a lot of work in Monkey Bay in Belize, and they mainly use wet season and dry season, but the onset of those seasons can differ each year. So even if they say we burn during the wet season, I'm like, well, when did the wet season start, right? And if you're talking about seasons that are quite long, like growing and dormant, you know if you burn at the beginning of the dormant season, it might be slightly different than if you burn at the end, because plants are in different physiological stages during those times. So just an example here of how some of these even overlap. You could say that you're burning in the dry season, but we know that our growing season starts before the dry season ends. So just saying I'm burning during the growing season, it's going to make a big difference as to whether you're burning during the dry growing season or the wet growing season. So just an example. And as I mentioned before, burning during different times can potentially affect different plant species differently because they're in different stages. So for instance, we know that if we burn when grasses are tillering, we're often going to reduce the amount of tillering because we hit them when they're sensitive to that vegetative spread. Now, if we are altering populations, this is of course going to trickle up to affect the whole community. So for instance, if you're doing control on a particular species, say oaks, you're going to see the removal of oaks be potentially will potentially increase the abundance of other species. Yeah, thank you. So it's when grasses are putting up new shoots. So it's a vegetative growth on grasses. Yeah. And if anyone has any other questions as I go, please let me know. So one good example that we might think of is wiregrass, and many of us are familiar with this species, Arista brachiana. We know that if we burn during the winter, so say a January burn, because I'm going to be specific, we will actually see the plant flower in June, but it doesn't produce many seeds, and those seeds that it produces are typically not viable. Now, if we burn after summer or during the summer, so late May, early June, we see a large production of seeds, and those seeds are viable. They will germinate, so about 75%. So this is a good example of when you're burning during a particular life stage, it will often result in differences in the life cycle in the population of these plants. A lot of times when you look in the literature and you look at studies of fire seasonality, they're very limited. They're either short-term, so researchers will burn one time and then present the results. And y'all know burning just one time is not the end-all be-all, right? You have to burn multiple times during a particular season to actually see, potentially see some results. Most of them are also confounded with time since fire. So they, for instance, look at the percent cover of shrubs. So if you burn in January, and then you burn in June, and then you look at the percent cover of shrubs in November, which one is going to be higher? It's kind of common sense that the longer time since fire, the greater amount of cover you're going to see in a lot of these species. So most of these studies really reflect the effects of the most recent fire rather than the longer-term fire regime. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I'm going to introduce you to an awesome study. So we examined data from the only controlled long-term fire seasonality study in the southeastern US. This was conducted in Mesic Flatwoods, Xeric Sandhills of St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. These different areas with replication were burned in different seasons. And we asked what the effects were of these biennial fires during different seasons on community composition. So this area during the early 80s, about 82, 83, they were first burned, the oaks were thinned, and then they began this regimen of fires where there were 8 plots in Flatwoods, 8 in Sandhills, and they were burned every 6 weeks. Not each individual plot, but the treatment plot for that particular burn was burned every 6 weeks. So there's a nice gradient of burn timing. Okay, so this project went on for 30 years. I always say this project was conceived before I was conceived. So it was going on a very long time. We took these plots and we divided them all kinds of different ways for analyses. And when I say we overanalyzed data, we overanalyzed data. We looked at whether dormant season mattered, whether dormant versus growing season mattered, whether early, late, early dry, late dry, early wet, late wet. We looked at winter, spring, summer, fall. We combined these plots in every way that you could imagine. And the metric that we studied was the frequency of occurrence within plots. So we were interested, we had 100 different subplots within the larger treatments, and we went to each of those and we said, is the plant present or is it absence? So we had some sort of frequency of occurrence. This is a more robust measure than something like percent cover or number of stems, because it's not confounded with time since fire, but I will say we also standardized with time since fire and measured multiple times per year. And our hypothesis was that the pine savanna fire regimes, the different seasonality, will result in divergent community composition. And so our prediction is if you burn during the fall or winter, it would separate from the spring and summer, and we would see different community compositions, divergence. We didn't. Anyone surprised? Burning every 2 years during different seasons for 30 years did not result in divergence. You're burning, you're doing a good job. Let me tell you about another study. This one is from the Avon Park Air Force Range. We did this study across, 10, 12 different communities, Mesic, dry, calcareous, wet prairies, you name it. If you've been to Avon Park, you know they have about everything you can imagine. They also burn really frequently. Sometimes areas burn more than twice a year. So we were really curious, when we have plots that are aggregated within a certain burn unit, and they're getting all of these burn treatments, then are we starting to see that they're sort of diverging? So if we see in this area there's super frequent fires are mostly occurring during the summer, are they diverging from plots that have less frequent fire, maybe occurring during the fall? We needed something to sort of back up what we were seeing in St. Mark's. Okay, I'm not going to show you many graphs. But I'm showing you this one because I looked at it and I immediately thought it looked like some big crazy spider web from one of those NASA experiments on spiders on drugs. It seriously looks like these plant communities were given caffeine because they're not following any trend. So what would I expect on this? If we were starting to see these fire treatments moving in any particular direction, we would start to see the arrows that are here diverging. They'd be going in different directions. We would see some pattern. I don't see a pattern here. There's nothing. Now, we do see there's probably two different groups. There's that elevational gradient coming back into these. And I'm just showing you all the transects here in the wet mesic, but they look exactly the same as any of the others that we studied. Spiders on drugs. It's a cool study. So let's pull out just one fire unit and just the one transect. This is from a wet mesic savanna, and let's look at whether there are any patterns. And there aren't. They just all revolve around each other. It's very similar. So whether you're burning in different seasons or you're burning more or less frequently, as long as you're burning and you're within that fire regime for that system, we are not seeing any changes in community composition. I'll show you one more graph, and I think this one is super interesting. So we started saying, why are these so consistent over time? And what we find is that plants, the rare species, kind of blip in and out. And these are 1 by 1 meter plots. They're not big. So by blipping out, it could be a rhizomatous species that's outside of the plot one year and then it's back in the next year, right? They don't go anywhere. These systems, once they're established, are very, very, very stable. And that stability is the result of dominant species that just persist. They don't change over time. They don't increase. They don't decrease. They persist over time. And some of these, Quercus minima, so we've got an oak in here, Sereno repens, the saw palmetto, Arista burkiana, wiregrass. Some of these you're probably familiar with, but it's these species that have established and remain consistent through time that results in a lot of that stability. It results in those plots not changing much. And I can't emphasize enough that, we have gone out in the field with someone, taken a map of the plot, and there's one plant in the same corner of that plot since the 1980s. So very, very, very stable systems. If you're burning, you're doing a good job. So our results from these studies show some different patterns than previous studies. We typically hear that dormant season fires overwhelmingly increase the abundance of woody species. I think that's a time since fire effect. But you don't lose the other species in the community, which is great news. If if your goal is growing season burns, great. We'll talk about the benefits of those in a minute. But if all you can do is burn during the dormant season, you are not going to lose anything. You're not going to lose species from your system. Where you start losing them is if you don't burn. So if you're burning, you're doing a good job. We also found that the variable fire regime also resulted in little community change over time, and that maintaining dominant species might be the most important to biodiversity. Jen Phil, whom some of you know, a research associate in my lab, she had this great quote, if you build it, they will come. We know that one, right? If you maintain it, they will stay. And that's what she says. If you maintain it, they will stay. Which I think is a really good takeaway from this study. Sure. I'm talking about composition. Yes, whether or not the plants are present. Now, can you slightly adjust maybe how frequent they are? Probably not. They're going to stay within that community. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, thank you. So I just got a question, like, let's clarify you're talking about plants and not animals. Absolutely, I'm talking about plants. But thank you for that lead-in, because, yeah.
So we got a question that says, would non-natives be considered dominant, stable, or established, or established?
Yeah, that's sort of opening that can of worms, right? It really depends on the invasive species. We have some that are really good at affecting their neighbors, the neighboring plants. And so I think that a lot of invasive species act in a different way than a lot of our native species. So this would really not apply to those invasive species. We would need to do more study on that. Anyone in here who's taken my class knows that we talk about the kill-eye neighbor hypothesis. A lot of invasive species actually increase fire intensity, and because of that, they will actually kill their neighbors. That opens up a spot then for them to inhabit after that fire. So I would not consider invasive species in this, and I would say that depending on the invasive species, we'd need more research. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So I really appreciate your question, because targeting specific seasons does have some benefits. Okay? If we are burning during the growing season, we are going to see flowering synchrony during the fall. We've probably all noticed that. We do that nice June burn. We get all those beautiful, beautiful flowers during the fall. And those flowers have a lot of benefits for our pollinators, for the production of viable seeds for some species, although I'll say more on that, but also seed availability to a lot of our critters. So it is really important to think about other goals besides plant communities when you're applying fire regimes during different seasons. Is that kind of, that's my little caveat. Okay, so consider multiple fire regime characteristics. So we're thinking about seasonality, frequency, also heterogeneity, which we talked about with the Hypericum or St. John species. I want to point out one more study, which I think is really, really interesting. This was done by Mary Nell Armstrong. Some of you know her. She did this for her master's thesis, where she had this whole group of undergraduates. I know there's at least one in the room today who participated on this study. And what they were really interested in is looking at species, so 6 different species here, that were burned during different times. And they looked at flowers produced or the viable seeds collected in the year that they were burned and then the following year. So across the x-axis, you see whether they were burned in January, March, or June. Across the top, you see whether they counted flowers and seeds during the year of the fire or the following year, whenever these plants happen to flower. But they mostly targeted fall flowering plants, because we know that a lot of folks actually collect wiregrass seed during the fall after doing June burns. And so we wanted to see, well, what else are they catching when they're out there with a flail vac collecting wiregrass seeds? So the first thing that I want to point out, I'm bad with a laser, but I'm going to try here. Okay, well, we're not going to do that. So the March, less than 1 year, in the center top left, you'll see that there's a dark blue there, and that is wiregrass, Arista brachiana. So we looked at flowers produced, and you'll see that burning in March produces lots of flowers. Burning in June produces some flowers for wiregrass. But then if you look at the viable seeds, so not only did we count flowers, but Mary Nell and her troop of students collected seeds and determined whether they would germinate. And what she found is that not all season or time since fire is really going to result in those seeds being produced. Sometimes we see flowers, but they don't produce seeds that will actually germinate, and that's what I mean by the seeds being viable. So for instance, if you want to collect seeds of Sargastrum, you're going to have to wait a year since fire to collect. But the season of fire doesn't really matter. You're going to get about the same number of seeds, whether you've burned in January, March, or June. So what did Mary Nell conclude from all of this? It is that if you're collecting seeds for restoration and you want a diverse mix, you're going to have to go to at least two different burn units. So maybe one that was burned in June of one year, but then go to another unit that was burned in January, March, or June of the previous year. And it's really going to increase the number of seeds that you've collected. This also means that although we see lots and lots of flowers after a growing season burn, a lot of those flowers are not producing seeds that actually germinate. Burning during a different season actually can increase the number of seeds that are produced. So it's a bit of an optical illusion. You see flowers, but they're not producing those seeds that will germinate. Okay. Any questions? I also want to note that fire season and frequency can interact. So we've been doing, following individual wiregrass plants, about 15,000 last I heard. We've been following them for about 6 years, looking at different seasons of burn, how precipitation and everything else affects the seeds that are produced. And what we have found when we look at winter or January burns versus summer or June burns is that we get more seeds produced after those summer burns and more of those seeds actually germinate. But it really differs for that summer or June burn, whether you're burning every year or say every 3 years. If you burn every year, the seeds eventually start to look like dust. Like you touch the seeds and they fall apart. They are not able to germinate. So burning too frequently can also have an effect on the populations of these plants, on the production of seeds. Okay. Now, you all know that there is a balance between prioritizing fire frequency and fire season. We did a conversation cafe at the SAF conference last year, and some of the quotes that I really like, season first if possible, but if conditions don't occur, then frequency. Frequency is the real driver, seasonality is additive. I agree. And depends on management goals, right? So, if your management goal is really to promote the production of flowers for those pollinators, well then burning during the summer, that's a great way to go. So David Godwin made this, and I think it's just great. Fire frequency, fire season, fire frequency, just burn it, right? Just burn it. So I'll end on this note again. If you're burning, you're doing a great job, okay? If you're burning during a different season, based on your objectives, you're just fine-tuning. You're just fine-tuning. But it's getting that frequency, getting fire on the ground that is really so important. So I commend all of you for burning. You're doing a great job. These studies, we have lots of people to thank. I'm also going to put in a plug that if any of you are burning and you need volunteers, I have lots of students. They come with their own NOMEX, variable levels of training, but they're always eager and excited to help. Before questions, I also want to put in a plug for Ludi Bond. I bet at least half of you know Ludi. She's amazing. She's working on her PhD, and she has a survey on trusted messengers. So please, there'll be a QR code that'll flash during breaks. And also there are some surveys on the table. Please, please, please fill one out. We really want to know from you all more about trusted messengers. And I'm happy to take any questions.